The Canadians fought with an intensity unmatched by others. They launched assaults under the cover of darkness. They charged even in torrential rain. They did not hesitate in the face of injuries. These insights were not the product of a propaganda official attempting to evoke fear in citizens, nor were they the exaggerated fears of a frightened soldier. Rather, they were objective assessments recorded by seasoned German officers during the peak of World War II. For the Wehrmacht, and particularly for the zealous divisions of the Waffen-SS, the Western Front became a harrowing experience filled with relentless firepower. Yet within that chaos, a distinct pecking order of fear emerged. When a German soldier gazed across the devastated landscapes of Normandy or the crumbling streets of Italy, he identified three clear adversaries. He recognized the Americans and feared their industrial might, the ceaseless waves of tanks, the skies choked with aircraft, and the seemingly boundless supply of artillery that could obliterate entire areas. He acknowledged the British, admiring their resilience, unwavering discipline, and the formidable presence of an empire that had weathered 5 years of total warfare without breaking. However, when he turned his gaze toward the Canadians, the sentiment shifted. The fear surrounding Canadian soldiers stemmed not from their machinery or sheer numbers, but from the men themselves. This raises one of the most fascinating questions of the entire war. Why was it that the German High Command, the architects of Blitzkrieg, considered a modest volunteer force from a distant dominion to be their most formidable infantry adversaries? Why, in the clandestine evaluations of the SS, were Canadians frequently deemed more ferocious than both their American and British counterparts? The explanation does not reside in the elaborate strategic plans of generals like Eisenhower or Montgomery. Instead, it lies in the sludge of the Scheldt, where soldiers battled knee-deep in icy waters. It is found in the wrecked homes of Ortona, where the conventions of civilized warfare gave way to the use of knives and grenades. It is rooted in a frightful reputation that Canadians did not merely inherit from their forebears in the First World War, they constructed it anew with a brutality that astonished even their allies. To grasp this peculiar phenomenon, we must first dismantle the contemporary image of Canada. Nowadays, the world perceives Canada as a nation of peacekeepers, characterized by kindness and negotiation. However, Canada from 1939 to 1945 was a vastly different entity altogether. It was a country carving its identity through the crucible of war. While the United States wielded the enormous power of mass production on the battlefield, deploying a vast army that often depended on inexperienced draftees to fill its growing ranks, Canada opted for an alternative approach. The Canadian Army was relatively small, comprising only 5 infantry divisions and 2 armored brigades in Europe. Yet what it lacked in size, it compensated for with a formidable concentration of lethal force. Unlike the American strategy, which constantly rotated troops, or the model, which had been exhausted and weary from fighting alone since 1940, saw the Canadians spending years in Britain preparing. They practiced, they exercised, they strengthened their resolve. They embraced the shock infantry doctrine, which emphasized aggression, initiative, and violent momentum over caution. By the time they were deployed in Fortress Europe, the typical Canadian soldier was not merely a volunteer. He was a tightly wound spring of suppressed aggression. The Germans quickly recognized that these were not men who merely fought for ground. They engaged with a deeply personal intensity that was unsettling. While an American unit might request an airstrike to eliminate a machine gun nest, and a British unit might maneuver around it cautiously, the Germans found that Canadian units were remarkably eager to close the distance, charging positions head-on in conditions that other armies considered impossible. The difference was clear in the eyes of the enemy. Intelligence reports captured from the German 71st Infantry Division in Italy noted a noticeable decline in morale upon realizing they were facing the Canadians. The report stated plainly, "The Americans kill you with their equipment, the British kill you with their persistence, the Canadians kill you because they want to." This video is more than just a record of battles. It is an exploration of why the Wehrmacht,
The most professional army of the 20th century dreaded the sight of the maple leaf insignia. We will traverse the swamp of death in the Scheldt, the narrow streets of Ortona, and the killing fields of Normandy to uncover the harsh reality that history often ignores. The Canadians were the Allies' shock troops, called upon to undertake the dangerous tasks that no one else could or would handle. To comprehend the depth of German unease, one must look beyond the propaganda films and delve into the dusty records of the Wehrmacht's field communications. It is in the urgent typewritten reports sent from the front lines back to Berlin that the true image of the Canadian soldier becomes apparent. It was an image characterized not by the nobility of knights, but by the ferocity of predators. German military strategy was predicated on precision, timing, and the superiority of their stormtrooper tactics. They were used to foes who fought in a predictable rhythm. The British, for instance, were known to take pauses. They would secure a target, consolidate their gains, have tea, and wait for supply lines to catch up. This predictable tempo allowed German commanders time to regroup and devise counterattacks. The Canadians, however, steadfastly refused to adhere to these protocols. An intelligence assessment captured from a panzer division in Italy noted an alarming trend. The Canadians combat aggressively and with no mercy. They do not acknowledge the natural pauses of conflict. This constituted the first pillar of German apprehension, the unrelenting pursuit. When night fell, the battlefield was expected to fall silent. Night operations were notoriously challenging, chaotic, and perilous. Most Allied commanders preferred to entrench themselves and wait for daylight. However, the Canadians, drawing upon a rugged adaptability likely shaped by the harsh wilderness of their homeland, dominated the night. They became experts in nocturnal raids. German sentries discovered that darkness provided no sanctuary. In fact, it was during the night that the wild men were at their most feared, more likely to attack. A German paratrooper, Fallschirmjäger, who was captured near Ortona, admitted that they could never let their guard down against the Canadians because they moved stealthily and struck with knives. Additionally, there was the weather in the European theater. Rain and mud were expected to be the great equalizers, the elements that hindered offensives and led to stalemates. However, accounts from the Scheldt estuary, a campaign fought in dreadful conditions of flooding and freezing mud, revealed disbelief among the troops. They attacked in weather that no one should consider fighting in, one officer noted. While other armies waited for clear skies to optimize their air support, the Canadians pushed forward through torrential rainstorms and waist-deep muck. To the German soldier shivering in their foxholes, witnessing an enemy emerge from the shadows of a freezing storm was psychologically devastating. It indicated that there was no safe haven, no aspect of nature that could protect them. But it was not merely pure aggression. While Canadians were fierce fighters in close quarters, they were also coldly efficient technicians at range. This brings us to the second source of fear, artillery. The German army held American artillery in high regard for its volume, but they feared Canadian artillery for its accuracy. Learning from the hard-earned experiences of the Canadian Corps in World War I, who had mastered counter-battery fire at Vimy Ridge, Canadian gunners in World War II were arguably the best in the Allied coalition. German veterans often drew comparisons between Canadian artillery coordination and that of the Soviets, the highest praise of fear they could offer. The Canadians didn't merely fire, they orchestrated devastation. They employed the creeping barrage with a terrifying expertise, moving a curtain of exploding shells mere yards ahead of their advancing infantry. For a German soldier, this meant that there was no window of opportunity, no moment to raise his head and man his machine gun between the cessation of the shelling and the arrival of the infantry. As soon as the explosions quieted, the Canadians were already in the trench, bayonets at the ready. A German report from the Rhineland succinctly cautioned its troops, "If the shelling stops, do not look up. They are already there." Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all was the Canadian refusal to retreat. In the fast-paced nature of mobile warfare, tactical retreats were common. If a unit found itself outflanked or significantly hit, it would fall back to preserve lives. Yet time and again, German counterattacks, a famed tactic that characterized German defense, would crash into Canadian lines and fail. At Vimy Ridge in Normandy, against the elite 1st SS Panzer Corps, weaker units might have crumbled under the assault of Tiger tanks and fanatical infantry. The Canadians bent under the pressure. They suffered horrific casualties, yet they did not break. They clung to the ground with a steadfastness that defied tactical reasoning. To the German military mindset, which valued military logic, this stubbornness was exasperating. It transformed minor clashes into protracted wars of attrition that the dwindling German forces scarcely could afford. However, a darker shadow loomed over this reputation, one that extended beyond tactics and resilience. As the war continued, a cycle of violence developed between Canadian units and the Waffen-SS that intensified into something personal. It was no longer just about gaining territory. In the hedges of Normandy, after rumors and evidence of Canadian prisoners.
As news of prisoners being executed by the SS spread, a grim determination settled within the Canadian forces. The phrase, "take no prisoners," started to be murmured and adopted. The Germans understood that they were confronting Canadians who had tapped into a deep well of cold fury. They were not facing hesitant conscripts, they were up against men who had crossed an ocean to seek vengeance. This psychological advantage led a German commander to deliver a stark caution to his successors. Be wary of the Americans, they possess the tanks, but fear the Canadians, for they harbor the rage. However, this formidable reputation was merely an introduction. The real test of this dread would manifest in three specific horrors: a submerged estuary, a medieval town transformed into a slaughterhouse, and a cursed beach. Reputation holds significance, but reality is paramount. The German apprehension of the Canadian infantry was not grounded in whispers exchanged in mess halls, but in the unyielding truths revealed on the battlefield. As the war advanced, a consistent pattern emerged within Allied high command. When a target was seen as too formidable, too heavily protected, or the terrain too daunting for conventional operations, the directive was frequently given: send in the Canadians. This designation as the fixers of the Allied line placed the Canadian Army amid some of the most harrowing conditions of the war, forging their legacy in three distinct trials by fire. The initial trial occurred in Ortona, Italy, in December 1943. For the German paratroopers of the elite 1st Parachute Division tasked with its defense, Ortona stood as a fortress. Its narrow medieval streets, sturdy stone structures, and towering rubble created a haven for snipers. It was a trap crafted to drain an attacking army of its strength. The British 8th Army had reached a standstill, and the Americans were preoccupied elsewhere. It was left to the Canadians to shatter the impasse. What ensued was a battle characterized by such brutality that journalists labeled it Little Stalingrad. Yet it was here that the Germans came to realize an alarming truth about Canadian resourcefulness. Understanding that venturing onto the streets meant certain death at the hands of German snipers, the Canadians redefined urban combat. They devised a tactic referred to as mouse-holing. Rather than using doors or windows, Canadian soldiers would create a breach through the attic wall of one building into an adjoining one. They would hurl grenades inside, unleash a barrage of submachine gun fire, and then rush through the haze of dust and smoke to secure the room in fierce hand-to-hand confrontations. They traversed the entire town without ever setting foot on the cobblestone streets. The German defenders were bewildered. They anticipated facing an adversary that would advance down the roads, and were unprepared for an enemy that consumed their way through the walls like pests of concrete and steel. The brutality of the close-quarters combat in Ortona, fought with knives,
bayonets, and bare hands, eroded the confidence of the elite Fallschirmjäger. They had encountered their equal not in larger numbers, but in raw, unrefined fighting tenacity. If Ortona represented a nightmare of stone, then the Battle of the Scheldt in late 1944 embodied a nightmare of mud. This battle would become perhaps the defining moment of the Canadian war effort, clearly demonstrating why the Germans held them in such fear. The Allies were in urgent need of the port of Antwerp to support their armies, but the routes leading to it were perilously challenging. The German fortifications were managed amidst a landscape that was reclaimed but flooded. The conditions of the terrain were horrendous. It consisted of flat, submerged polders, water up to one's waist that was freezing, and mud that consumed men entirely. It was a mission destined for failure. The British armor divisions were unable to function there. The Americans were concentrating on advancing toward the Rhine. Once again, the task fell to the 1st Canadian Army. The German commanders defending the Scheldt referred to it as the Swamp of Death. They thought the landscape itself was their strongest ally, making any infantry assault unfeasible. They were mistaken. The Canadians launched their attack. They charged over exposed dikes under machine gun fire. They fought through waters that were stained red with blood. They employed vehicles such as the Buffalo amphibious carriers, but relied primarily on their determination. The psychological effect on the German defenders was significant. Witnessing an enemy steadily advancing through icy waters, disregarding mines and mortars, instilled a sense of inevitable defeat. It shattered their resolve. A captured German major noted that, while American soldiers performed well when given dry socks and a warm meal, Canadian soldiers fought as if the adversity of the elements was their natural environment. By clearing the Scheldt, the Canadians not only opened a port, but also demonstrated that there was no terrain on Earth where they could not inflict casualties. And then came Normandy. Although D-Day is often recalled for the American losses at Omaha Beach, the Canadian assault at Juno Beach was equally hazardous. Confronted with bunkers, seawalls, and a rising tide that delayed their landing crafts, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division charged ashore directly against the formidable Atlantic Wall. Nevertheless, by the conclusion of that longest day, the Canadians had advanced further into France than any other Allied force, whether American or British. However, the true brutality and the true establishment of the reputation emerged in the subsequent days. In the hedgerows of Caen, they encountered the 12th SS Panzer Division, composed of fervent teenagers directed by seasoned veterans from the Eastern Front. The combat was primitive and filled with deep-seated animosity. After the SS executed Canadian prisoners at the Abbaye d'Ardenne, the nature of the conflict shifted. News spread rapidly through the Canadian ranks. The conventions of war were abandoned. The Canadians ceased taking prisoners. The SS, accustomed to intimidating their enemies, were met with an adversary who reciprocated their fanaticism with a chilling, effective rage. The Canadians garnered a reputation among the SS, not merely as soldiers, but also as executioners. In the brutal battles for Caen and the Falaise Pocket, the Canadians served as the anvil on which the German forces were shattered. The fear they instilled was so immense that German units frequently attempted to surrender to British or American forces on their flanks instead of confronting the Canadians. From the ruins of Ortona to the muck of the Scheldt and the hedgerows of Normandy, the message was unmistakable. The Canadians were not merely engaged in the war. They were bringing it to an end, one brutal yard at a time. To truly understand the distinct position of the Canadian infantry, we must compare them with their fellow soldiers. The Allied invasion of Europe was a collaborative endeavor, a massive trident thrust aimed at the core of the Third Reich. However, to the German commanders watching from in their bunkers, the three factions of this trident, American, British, and Canadian, each felt distinctly different when they struck the surface. For beginners, consider the Americans. By 1944, the United States Army had evolved into a formidable force. For the German High Command, the Americans symbolized the daunting inevitability of industrial warfare. Their logistical capabilities were the envy of nations worldwide. If a German Tiger tank managed to destroy a convoy of 5 American Shermans, the very next day, 10 more would come into view. The German anxieties regarding the Americans stemmed from a sense of suffocation. They were aware that engaging in a war of attrition against a nation capable of producing tanks faster than they could manufacture bullets was a losing battle. However, when it came to infantry in particular, the German perspective was often critical. In internal communications within the Wehrmacht, American infantry units were regularly characterized as courageous but unseasoned. The rapid expansion of the U.S. Army meant that many units entering combat in 1944 were inexperienced. They relied heavily on their overwhelming firepower to address tactical challenges. When encountering a machine gun position, American forces would typically pause to request air support or a significant artillery strike to obliterate the entire grid square. This approach was effective, certainly, but it lacked the personal touch of close combat tactics. The German soldier respected the American war machine, but believed that man for man in a fair fight, he was superior to the American GI. Now, let's consider the British. The British Army was the battle-hardened veteran of the conflict. They had been engaged in combat since 1939, experiencing the disgrace of Dunkirk, the bombing of London, and the intense battles in North Africa. By the time they reached Normandy, British soldiers were highly trained, resilient, and technically skilled. However, the British Army was also exhausted. After 5 years of total warfare, Britain was depleting its manpower. This demographic situation influenced their tactical strategies. Field Marshal Montgomery and his leadership were well known for their cautious approach. They employed a bite-and-hold strategy, aimed at minimizing casualties. They would secure an objective and promptly entrench themselves, reluctant to take unnecessary
In defense, they didn't regard his unpredictability with fear. They understood that the British would seldom undertake reckless risks. They were predictable, steady, dangerous, but systematic. Then there were the Canadians. The Canadian Army existed in a formidable middle ground, blending the strengths of both allies while eliminating their perceived vulnerabilities. Like the British, they were equipped with the finest training and doctrine of the Commonwealth. They displayed discipline and could coordinate artillery and armored units with a sophistication matching that of the Royal Army. Yet, unlike the British, they were not fatigued from war. They were revitalized. They showcased the high morale and physical endurance of a volunteer force that had diligently prepared for this moment for years. Moreover, akin to the Americans, they exhibited an aggressive, can-do mentality, a frontier spirit that prized initiative and adaptability. But in contrast to the Americans, they were not untrained. The backbone of the Canadian infantry comprised long-serving volunteers who had refined their abilities in the commando training facilities of Scotland before they ever set foot in France. The combination resulted in a type of soldier that the Germans found impossible to classify, making them difficult to combat. The Canadians approached battle with the technical accuracy of the British, but launched their assaults with the wild enthusiasm of a newly deployed American unit. German General Eberhard Kinzel, in his assessment of the Allied forces, observed that while the British would pause to regroup, the Canadians continued their advance. They employed deep battle tactics. Upon breaking through an enemy line, they wouldn't simply establish a defensive position. Instead, they surged into the enemy's rear, unsettling supply chains and command posts. They embodied true shock troops. Additionally, there was a political factor that fueled their intensity on the battlefield. Canadian generals like Guy Simons were not merely fighting for territory, they were fighting for national recognition. Canada, a smaller nation, sought to demonstrate its significance internationally. They aimed for complex, high-profile objectives to showcase their capabilities. This mindset permeated down to the individual soldiers.
They were not merely a subordinate unit within the British Empire, they were proudly fighting as Canadians. This sense of national pride fostered an incredibly resilient unit cohesion. German soldiers experienced this difference in a visceral way. Engaging an American sector meant enduring heavy artillery fire. Confronting a British sector entailed a war of attrition. However, facing a Canadian sector signified the likelihood of a nighttime assault during a rainstorm by soldiers who expertly wielded their bayonets and appeared to take grim pleasure in the brutal nature of close combat fighting. As one officer from the 12th SS Panzer Division reportedly said during interrogation, "We knew when we were up against the Canadians, the fighting was fiercer, the shelling was more intense, and there was no mercy shown." It was not that the Canadians were superhuman, rather they represented an ideal blend of training, motivation, and timing. They entered the battle at a moment when the Germans were vulnerable and struck with a force that was both heavy-handed and precise. This brings us back to a question that lingers in the records of the Second World War. Why did the formidable Wehrmacht, who had conquered Europe, feel fear at the presence of the Canadians? It was not due to any invincibility of the Canadian Army. They suffered significant casualties, and the rates for Canadian infantry units during the Normandy campaign were among the highest of all Allied nations. Yet it was this very readiness to suffer losses that instilled fear in the enemy. The Germans, well versed in the art of war, grasped strategy, tactics, and principles of self-preservation. They perceived the Americans as a glimpse of the future, a conflict driven by machinery and overwhelming logistics. The British represented the past, a conflict characterized by imperial might and unwavering discipline. In contrast, the Canadians embodied something more instinctual. They were seen as adversaries who fought not for broader strategy, but for the very inch of ground directly beneath their feet. Canadian infantrymen emerged as the frightening specter on the Western Front because they defied the psychological norms of modern warfare. They launched attacks when it would typically be deemed illogical. They fought when retreat was the prudent choice. And they harbored a deep-seated vendetta that transformed professional soldiers into relentless avengers. From the sniper-ridden ruins of Ortona to the waterlogged dikes of the Scheldt, the Canadians took on the toughest tasks. They were the formidable force of the British Empire, only utilized when all else failed. This perception came with a heavy price. Being the finest meant being dispatched to the harshest locations. The titles of battles like DEP, Ortona, Verrier Ridge, the Scheldt, and the Holka Gap represent more than just victories. They're reminders of lives lost. Yet from these resting places, a new sense of national identity emerged. Canada did not come out of World War II simply as a British colony, but as a nation tempered by hardship, insisting on its right to a place among nations, not due to its population, but because of its profound sacrifices. For the German soldier crouched in his foxhole in 1945, witnessing the relentless progress of the khaki-clad soldiers from the north, the subtleties of global politics were irrelevant. What mattered most was the fear, a fear that was distinctly Canadian. Perhaps the most haunting assessment of the German experience facing Canada was captured not in a history book written years later, but in the immediate, terror-stricken evaluation of a German officer from the 346th Infantry Division. As his defenses fell apart and his troops capitulated to the fierce fighters they had come to dread, he penned a final report that distilled the hopelessness of resisting them. His words resonate through the years, serving as a tribute to the alarming effectiveness of the Canadian Corps. When Americans strike, we request artillery support. When the British launch an attack, we call for reinforcements. However, when the Canadians appeared, we were aware that the fight was lost.